Now, you might remember when there was a lot of discussion around the idea that spike protein from COVID injections may last longer in the body than the 48 hours claimed by experts. Now, of course, this was heavily controversial at the time, and most fact checkers were just shutting down this discussion very, very quickly. Now, the CDC at the time was claiming, all the way up until July 2022 that just passed, the following. And here's what it looked like. I want to draw your attention to the area that says the mRNA and the spike protein do not last long in the body. And then it talks about how our cells break down the mRNA from these vaccinations and get rid of it within a few days after vaccination. Scientists estimate that the spike protein, like other proteins our bodies create, may stay in the body up to a few weeks. So this was the CDC's stance on this. And I want to remind you again, this is up until July 2022. Now, though, it looks like this. So if you can't tell, they've essentially removed that entire part about the mRNA and the spike protein not lasting long in the body and the two bullet points that go through with this. I also want to point to our attention is where they acknowledge when they've last updated this particular piece. You can see that the last update they're claiming comes from July 15th, 2022. However, when you actually look at the Wayback Machine, which will show you the archives from the internet of various pages, it shows that the CDC actually had this up on their website, this particular chunk, all the way up until July 2022, from what we can see here. But they actually quietly changed it and did not care to update when they last updated this to sort of reflect this change that they made. So right off the top, they're removing something very, very huge, very, very controversial, and they're not telling people that they even updated it. So the first question here is, does this seem like a transparent behavior from a regulator who is literally, in many ways, guiding the entire world when it comes to discussion around COVID vaccines? Right? Obviously, this is a very important question to ask. Why is this change important? Right? This is what does this mean? What do these two bullet points ultimately mean? Let's first recall that the initial story was that the spike protein from these particular mRNA injections remains localized in the injection site for the most part, and that the spike protein itself would be rapidly cleared from the body. And this would avoid any long-lasting effects or any possible damage that could occur from these spike proteins down the road. So these were primary considerations when regulators were looking to approve these vaccines and ultimately say they were safe and push through the emergency use authorization. So now, when we see that the CDC has actually removed their claims around these two facts, ultimately not wanting to stand behind those statements any longer, we have to ask the question, why now? Obviously, we don't know that. But, ultimately, what does this mean about how or why they even approved it back in the day, right? So the truth here is that the claims of potential issues related to the spike protein, where it ended up in the body and what was actually going on, were actually happening in early 2021 before the EUA was ever really pushed through. So, we can recall that there was a doctor by the name of Dr. Byram Bridle, and he was saying that spike proteins may be having a damaging effect in the body, and that they're likely not staying at the injection site. And he was using several sources, which we're going to talk about in a second, to sort of back up his claims around that. But of course, the good news when Byram Bridle, came out and said that, factcheck.org was all over it. They all had us covered here, stating that there is no evidence to indicate that spike protein generated by human cells following vaccination are a toxin or that they circulate in the body and damage tissues, contrary to what Canadian virus immunologist recently claimed. All right, they're referring to Dr. Byram Bridle there. Now, obviously, in this case, factcheck.org left out the part that stated there is also no evidence that these proteins don't move throughout the body and damage tissues, which is a key thing to note, because the reality of the situation is it's like they're saying, well, there's no evidence to claim what he is saying is true, but there's also no evidence to claim what factcheck.org is claiming to be true. And at the end of the day, there was a little bit more evidence on Dr. Byram Bridle's side that they cared to acknowledge. And the funny part here is that what was factcheck.org's source from this entire thing? Of course, it's the CDC, right? They moved to the CDC to back up all their claims. And ultimately, the CDC we're now seeing are the same people that are stealth editing their work to cover up what I feel is ultimately their negligence around this particular issue. So the factcheck.org claims here, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the most intensive safety monitoring in U.S. history has found that most of the reported side effects after COVID-19 vaccination are minor, such as pain at the injection site or fever. Severe adverse reactions to the vaccines have been rare. So that's it. Factcheck.org goes to the CDC, says, this is all that's going on. There's no evidence, therefore it's debunked. So when you ultimately couple the two statements together, you realize that nothing really has been addressed here. To the public, it seems as though, all the things that Dr. Byron Brattle were bringing up, they're not really, it's all been debunked, right? But the reality of the situation is these facts were never really addressed in any of these fact checks. And now here in, August 2022, where we're recognizing that the CDC won't even stand behind their claims, this is a big deal. This means something here. So ultimately, here's how doctors and scientists have been trying to provide evidence to back their concerns on this particular issue of spike protein and where it ends up in the body. If we look back to March 2022, a paper came out discussing observations that show where the spike protein, is ultimately ending up, and that it's not necessarily staying at the ejection site. We should note that when we go through this particular piece, they're referring to observations made before and in and around the time of emergency use authorization. So this means that regulators knew some of this information before it was approved, and ultimately they approved it anyway. Now we're going to be referring to some animal testing here that was never really disclosed to the public at the time of the EUA. So let's look at the particular paper here. Biodistribution studies are fundamental to determine in which tissues and organs an injected compound travels and accumulates. To the author's knowledge, up to now, such evaluation has not been carried out on humans for any of the emergency use approved COVID-19 vaccines. A pharmacokinetic study performed by Pfizer for the Japanese regulatory agency shows that the LNPs, which is the liquid nanoparticles, display an off-target distribution on rodents, accumulating in the organs such as the spleen, liver, pituitary gland, thyroid ovaries, and in other tissues. Similarly, the results of a European agency assessment report shows an off-target distribution of the LNPs used by Pfizer and Moderna in the liver and other organs of rodents. So ultimately, what's being said here is that there were multiple signals that had been done multiple times on rodents showing that, the spike protein was moving throughout the body. Now, some people have been claiming that these, rodent studies were not that great, and ultimately, therefore, we can't trust the results, and they're kind of leaving the story there. But the reality of the situation is that regardless of these particular signals and what people have been saying, this was brought up to regulators and they decided to do or say nothing about it. It was kind of just brushed under the rug as if it didn't mean anything. Now, there are also some claims that, with mRNA vaccines, you don't really need to do biodistribution studies because, the idea is everything stays very concentrated around the injection site, and therefore we should just leave it at that. But when doctors and scientists are saying, hey, you know what, I don't know if this is true, there is some evidence of this, maybe we should actually look at this in humans, you would think that it would be taken seriously. However, it's not. And so for those who might be hearing what I just said and are saying, well, you know what, if it needed to be taken seriously, it would have been. And obviously, the CDC doesn't feel that needs to be taken seriously. Therefore, they never did these studies. Then I would come back to you and I would say, so then why did the CDC just remove these claims from their website? It seems more likely than not that the evidence may not be in their favor when it comes to these particular claims, and that's why they removed it. And obviously, this is a very important issue to discuss because these were the highly controversial claims that were causing many, many doctors and scientists to be censored. So ultimately, to summarize here, the CDC has now somewhat aligned its views with what quote-unquote anti-vaxxers have been saying since early 2021, that we don't know enough about these injections. We are unsure what happens with the spike protein in the body and where it ends up, right? That's ultimately what the CDC is acknowledging. And we ourselves here at The Pulse have had 2 pieces of content removed from YouTube in 2021 and 2022 for talking about these particular issues and simply reporting on them. And yet here now the CDC is acknowledging that those pieces of content were probably not false and they don't even want to stand behind their initial claims. And I want to be fair here in all of this discussion here that, vaccines during the time of COVID have done some good, right? I know a lot of people like to just say, well, it's either good or bad, but nothing is black and white, right? These things have done some good. And we have countless videos on our channel that have talked about that, but ultimately at what cost, right? And when we're talking about mandates, when we're talking about policies, when we're talking about blanket statements about how vaccines should be used, that's been the problem that most people are acknowledging. Not everybody necessarily needed to be vaccinated. And that's why we have to ask the question, at what cost have these policies ultimately gone through? We must acknowledge at the end of the day that the type of work from the CDC has ultimately been, pushed as a source for where these mandates came from. Well, we're mandating things because the CDC says everything is safe and effective and everything is good, right? Well, these mandates have cost people their livelihoods. It's cost them their friends. It's cost them their ability to live life fully. But now that we can see that there's ultimately a lack of science behind the CDC and their claims in a lot of cases, and we're also seeing there's a lack of transparency, we have to ask the question, do they ultimately seem trustworthy? And herein lies one of the biggest questions that we've been trying to raise awareness about, since the early days of the pandemic, which is ultimately that when claims are made, fact checkers are just going to the authority, which is the CDC. But if the CDC is wrong and they're not listening to signals from doctors and scientists, stuff that they're putting forth saying, hey, here's some of my evidence, let's take a look at it. And instead, they're just ridiculing and censoring these scientists. And then mainstream media follows along with that. We have to ask the question, what is really going on here, right? And because what ends up happening is just a year later, a year and a half later, the CDC, time and time again, will change their tune to match the scientists that they've censored. So we're seeing this pattern occur over and over and over again. And we ultimately cannot trust the CDC nor fact checkers because it appears that they're negligent in their work at the end of the day. And mainstream media is not really holding these institutions accountable. So we end up in a situation where we have this collective sense-making crisis because the vast majority of the public is simply taking their cues from mainstream media and authority figures like the CDC, who we just learned is not necessarily worthy of our trust, especially when there are so many other doctors and scientists raising a red flag going, hold on, let's just stop for a second and not have so much certainty about the things that we're saying. But again, like many things, I believe that this particular situation is ultimately an evolutionary pressure that pushes us towards better things. The veil is being lifted here. People are seeing more clearly what's been going on. And in the end, we're being challenged to develop better skills of collective sense making and ultimately better questioning to ultimately make it through this chaos, right? Because it's a very difficult time to navigate. If we cannot trust these authority figures, then what do we do, right? We have to learn how to discern other sources of information. We need to know how to discuss information effectively, and we need to be able to dialogue amongst each other respectfully and openly, which is something that has been very, very challenging throughout the time of COVID. A couple of things I often say to people is, get your information from multiple media sources. I don't care if you watch mainstream media, alternative media, grab from multiple sources and attempt to question what you hear. There is so much bunk, whether it's in the mainstream or the alternative space, it's out there, right? So get a good mix of information going and be open to questioning it. Look at the information that's being presented, seek to understand it, question the facts, and don't just assassinate the source simply because you don't like them. So a lot of times you'll hear people say, well, it's in mainstream media, it has to be false. This is not really a great way to go about navigating information. And, I kind of cringe every time I hear that statement. When you dialogue with people about these particular topics, ask questions, seek clarity on what people are actually saying and truly understand their position before you move forward. So for example, if two people are having a discussion, make sure that each other is clear on what the person is actually saying. Don't just assume what it is that they're saying. Ask questions, gain clarity, understand what's going on. The truth of the matter is if we're too sure about our particular position, we're probably just blinding ourselves from the truth at the end of the day. We want to always have that curiosity and that sense of openness to change our perspective as new information comes forth. And of course, by all means, I got to throw in a little plug here. Join our membership called the Explorer Lounge. In there, we have a ton of community dialogue just like this. We go through live sense-making sessions together from time to time. And we even have a course in there that helps us improve our awareness around bias and critical thinking. Tons of great features. Plus, you'll also support us in doing work like this because we've seen throughout the course of time that, independent media sources like us have not been, too privy to getting the help from big tech, right? And we've been demonetized in a number of ways. So this membership helps to push us to continue doing this work ultimately at the end of the day. But that's it. That's all. Be sure to subscribe, like, and pass this on to your friends.